Hi, I'm Jarrett Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. Imagine that you are an artist, an architect, a designer living in New York City 200 years ago. Where do you go to meet other artists? Where do you see contemporary work? Where do you learn new skills? There are no museums yet. There are no art schools like we have now. To combat this, to think about ways to meet other people and to learn new skills, a group of artists and architects founded what they called the New York Drawing Association to do just that. Modeled off the Royal Academy in London, these artists and architects wanted to promote fine arts in America through both exhibition and education. A few years later, they changed their name to the National Academy of Design. And over the last 200 years, they have become a professional honorary organization that has operated a school and a museum in New York. At its 200th anniversary, the Academy is reinventing itself again. A few years ago, it sold its buildings and it's relocated to Chelsea, where it's trying to figure out what the role of an organization like this is in a New York that is vastly different than it was in 1825. The questions the Academy is asking in many ways are the questions that interest me too, so I invited the current director, Gregory Wessner, on the show to talk about them. Gregory joined the National Academy in 2020, but has a long career in art and architecture nonprofits. Before the Academy, he was the executive of Open House New York, and before that, he spent 20 years at the Architectural League of New York, where he served in a variety of roles. Gregory and his team are asking big questions right now. What is the role of arts and architecture and culture today? What is the role of nonprofits in the arts and architecture fields? What does American art mean today? Who are we serving? Who is the audience? I wanted to ask Gregory about all of these questions and how he thinks about the evolution of the National Academy of Design over its 200-year history. We talk about how, despite the vast differences, these are in many ways the same questions the founders were asking themselves. We also talk more broadly about nonprofits, about design media, and how design's definition has changed over the last 200 years. If you haven't yet, be sure to subscribe to our Substack to be the first to know of new episodes, new stories on our sites, and receive our monthly newsletter. Paid subscribers get access to bonus interviews and really enable us to do what we do here. It really helps keep the show going. For the rest of December, we're offering paid subscriptions for 20% off for 2025, which means you can help support the show for as little as $4 a month or $40 for the next year. Head over to our site and sign up and help support this work. Thank you, as always, for listening, and here's my conversation with Gregory Wessner. On the National Academy of Design's website, you describe the mission is that the National Academy of Design promotes art and architecture in America through exhibition, education, and research. And I'm wondering what that looks like in practice. What does that look like on a day-to-day? Can you actually kind of talk about what it means to promote art and architecture through exhibition, education, and research?
Yeah, of course. So I guess at some point we'll get into there's a backstory that sort of led us to where we're at right now.
Yeah.
But last fall of 2023, we opened a new space at Chelsea. It's a roughly 7,800 square foot space that houses our offices, but also a gallery. So the exhibition component of that sentence is realized through the gallery that we operate on West 26th Street in Chelsea. Yeah. We have a rotating exhibition schedule that pulls both from the National Academy's collection. So the National Academy also has a collection of art, painting, sculpture, works on paper, architectural renderings, drawings, models, and such. And that's about 8,000 works in the collection.
Wow.
So we we curate exhibitions from the collection, but also invite artists who are not in the collection to submit work based on various exhibition themes or topics. So that's the exhibition that we do 3 to 4 exhibitions a year. Um, yeah, so in terms of exhibitions, we have the gallery space, and then the education component that has changed over the years. The National Academy was founded to provide like very direct instruction in art making. So it basically started as a drawing school,
Right.
essentially, and it provided classes and ran a school for, I'm not going to get my math right, but let's say up from 1826 to 2016, roughly,
Okay.
whatever that works out to be. At the time it closed, there was a dedicated building with, I'm not going to get this right either, but I think there were 4 studio spaces. Students came, they registered for classes. We had instructors. So that's education looked like studio instruction up through 2016. And then those buildings that housed the school at that point got sold. And that the sales were complete in 2019. And so I think what's interesting about the academy right now is that we're very much in the process of rethinking what
Mm-hmm.
education looks like
Mm-hmm.
and redefining that for us now. It's no longer instruction
Yeah.
because in 1825, when the National Academy was founded, there were no schools of art. And so there was a group of artists who self organized to create the organization that became the National Academy of Design for the purposes of providing education to aspiring artists. But in 2016, there are plenty of places you can go to get all kinds of instruction in the arts.
So I want to talk more about that in a
Yeah.
second, but
Okay.
I want to go back to one other thing that you said first. You mentioned that you have this collection that's
Mm-hmm.
over 8,000 works.
Yep.
Most of this, if not all of this, is donated by the academicians.
Yeah.
And you have, if I'm getting this right, there's a limit of 450 living academicians at one time,
Correct.
and there's 20 over 2,400 in your institution's history.
Yep.
Can you explain this structure to
Sure.
me? What is an academician?
Mm-hmm.
Why are they donating work? This to me feels so central to
Yeah.
all of this other work. This the exhibition, the education, the
Absolutely.
research. It all comes out of this. Can you explain this structure? How this works? Where this came from?
Yeah. Absolutely. I've sort of alluded to already. 1825. There's no place where an aspiring artist can go to learn their craft. So a group of artists in New York City, artists and architects, I should say, because and I think this is also something really interesting and critical, that it's artists and architects are
Right.
coming together and self-organizing to create this organization to provide instruction. And so if you think that in 1825, that of the sort of core pieces of the mission were education and exhibition,
Mm.
the third piece was to celebrate and recognize excellence in the arts. So to recognize artists and architects who were really sort of leading in their practice, and they did that through the election of academicians.
Okay.
So the leading artists and architects would be nominated and elected by other artists, and this is another key thing to emphasize: that it's all peer driven.
Mm.
So
Mhm.
artists and architects look around and say that person's doing incredible work. Let's recognize and celebrate them by making them a national academician. And then upon election, the incoming academician is asked to donate one of a representative sample of their work to the collection,
Okay.
and that's called the diploma work. And so and this has changed a little bit. I don't know how much in the weeds we want to get, but originally,
if there's a show to get in the weeds about
this
this
is it.
stuff,
This is
this
it.
is it.
Okay.
You're on it. Yeah.
So, so for a period of time, they were incoming artists and architects were elected as associate national academicians. It was a two-tiered
Mm.
system. So you first entered as an associate national academician, and at that point, you were asked to donate a portrait of yourself. So it could
Oh,
be either a
interesting.
self-portrait that you painted or made, or you could have a friend, some other artist make it for you.
Huh.
But so the earliest members were giving ultimately 2 works to the collection.
Okay.
But it also is the reason why the National Academy of Design has one of the largest collections of artist portraits in the world.
Okay.
So over
So those two portraits were, or those two works that they were donating. One
Yeah.
was a portrait of
One's a
themselves,
portrait of
and one was a
themselves to
representative
document what they
work.
look like.
Okay.
And then once they donate what's called the diploma portrait, they were in line
Okay.
to become a full academician. But to be a full academician, you had to donate the diploma work, which is a sample of what you make.
Okay. Okay.
And over 100, now 199 years, that has accumulated into a collection of over 8,000 works.
Okay.
And we say mostly or almost entirely, because there are some other works that have made their way into the collection over the 199 years. So just to be truthful, not everything was donated by the artist. Almost everything in the collection has been donated by the person who made it, which I think is a really interesting story about a collection.
I agree. I think that's really interesting. I think the idea of academicians is actually really interesting, and it feels unique and slightly unusual to
Mm-hmm.
me in kind of a contemporary setting. And I'm trying to think of the way to ask this question. I'm curious about how the selection of the academicians, and then once you are selected and you get that honor and you
Yeah.
donate that work, how does that work, and those 450 living
Yes.
artists and architects, how do they interact with the programming, the exhibition, the day-to-day work that you do? Is that something that is sort of honorary and they are just, they're honored and hands off, or are they actually really involved in the direction of the National Academy?
Yeah, they're very involved, and it's something that's really important to me as the director to really honor that involvement and to
Okay.
try to facilitate it as much as possible.
Okay.
Because the National Academy, as I said, in 1825, is founded by a group of artists and architects, and has been led by them throughout the entire 199 years. And so we say that we're rightfully that we are the artist. Oh, sorry, the oldest artist and architect led arts organization in the United States.
Okay.
But the question always comes as, well, what does that mean to be like led? How does that actually show up
That
on
was
a
my
day to
next
day
question.
basis?
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so there are committees. Half the board is current academicians,
Okay.
so they're represented at the level of the board. So they're making they're overseeing the finances, they're overseeing the programming, they're voting on big directional decisions of, when we moved to Chelsea, that was something that to selling the buildings on the Upper East Side was absolutely, a decision made by
Okay.
the membership or the academicians. We sort of interchangeably use those words.
Okay.
Um, and when I came to the academy in 2020 and took the job, um, this is after the buildings had been sold, but the academy is a little bit sort of nomadic and trying to figure
Yeah.
out what was going to happen next. And I was thinking about it, and truthfully, the academy had a reputation when it was on the Upper East Side for being a little bit dusty and conservative and old,
Yeah. Yeah.
and let's say boring.
Okay.
And I say that
Yeah.
in the kindest possible way. Like, I think there
Yeah.
was a lot of love for it, but it wasn't really, the place where you're going to go see the most innovative, cutting
Right.
edge work.
Right. Right.
Um, but as I thought about it, once they sold those buildings, it seemed for me to open up incredible opportunity. And you have this community of 450 artists and architects, which, if you look at the list, they are the most incredible
Yeah. Yeah.
practitioners, right? And I just thought, if you just tapped a little bit into the energy of the work that these people are making, you would have the most interesting, exciting organization. And so to take what we do, the program, the exhibitions, and really refocus it around the academicians. So
Okay.
long-winded way to get to your question is, I really think of it as like the academicians are at the heart of what we're doing, like to really just give them the platform and the rest will solve itself.
I want to stay on this thread for a second about the older perception that
Yeah.
this nearly 200-year institution is boring, is stuffy, is conservative. It was on the Upper East Side. And I have a two-part question here. I'm curious about how you today are thinking about evolving that and shedding some of that
Yeah.
that that perception. And then the maybe larger question is, how do you think about the position of the National Academy in relationship to the art world, to the architecture world,
Hmm.
to New York City, to the country? How maybe what I'm asking is like, is this art for artists? Is this architecture for architecture?
Yeah.
What's that translation from, art and architecture world to a New York City resident who wanders into your gallery?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
How do you think about that? And then how do you think about that in relationship to this kind of shedding of the,
Yeah.
historical stuffiness, I guess is
Yeah. Yeah.
kind
Yeah.
of what I'm
Yeah.
asking.
Yeah. Okay. These are two good questions. I think with and I should probably just clarify this, in terms of the image of the academy before. Maybe let's just say that's my opinion of it. That
Right,
was my
right. I
opinion,
understand. Yeah, I
but I
understand.
think I was not the only one to hold that opinion. And I might say it grew a little bit out of, on the Upper East Side. A lot of the exhibitions were driven by the collection, and the
Mm,
collection is strongest in 19th century work. And so there was a little bit of, you kept, the strongest parts of the collection kept getting shown, but that made it feel like it was always stuck in the 19th century. It
I
was a
see.
19th
Yeah.
century organization. Um, but with the sale of the buildings, like I said, I thought it really opened up incredible opportunity to reinvent this, what is now a 199-year-old organization, for the 21st century. And key to that was really, as I said, was, thinking about the DNA of the organization and going back to its founding, when it was founded by a group of contemporary artists,
Right.
contemporary for 1825, not trying to, creating a space where they could grow as artists and architects, to teach themselves. And equally important was to provide education for themselves, the exhibition program was as important because they wanted to show the
Yeah.
public what artists were doing and to educate the public about what contemporary art by living artists look like.
Right.
Because in 1825, there are no museums also in New York City. Like,
Okay.
I think it's important to be
Yeah, that's
explicit about this,
interesting.
because we take for granted, like, oh yeah, you would just go up to the Met and see the latest exhibition. There's no Metropolitan Museum. That Metropolitan Museum is not coming for another 45, 55 years, I think.
Oh, that's true. I didn't even make that timeline when I was thinking about this,
Yeah.
but yeah, that's really interesting.
So if you're an average New Yorker and you're going to have any experience with an artwork, chances are it's going to be a European old master,
Right.
and probably it's a copy or an engraving of a European old master. So you're
Right.
not there's nowhere where you're going to look at contemporary work by living artists. It just
Mhm.
doesn't really happen. So the exhibitions program was equally as important to show just the general public. And
Yeah.
this is also at a time in the country when everyone is obsessed with the idea of what is America, what is
Hmm.
American, how do we define that? It's the country is still young,
Hmm.
um, and so what is this thing called America? What does it mean to have an American art?
Uh-huh.
Um,
Let me ask you a weird question,
okay.
or maybe a weird question. You've alluded a couple times that next year, 2025, is
Yes.
200th anniversary.
Yep.
That is a momentous occasion, a time for
Yep.
reflection and thinking about the future. You've also mentioned a couple times about the goals of the founders in 1825 and some of the differences. There are no art museums, there are no art schools.
Hmm.
Um, the art and architecture culture of that time is very different. What you're saying now, though, about this being a period of questioning, what is America? What is American art? It strikes me that in a weird parallel, we are in a moment like that right now.
Oh,
We're
100%.
speaking
Yep.
the end of the week of the election. And I feel like these are some existential questions happening just
Yeah.
uh, in the country right now. I'm wondering what parallels you see. Where does 1825 and 2025 actually rhyme or come together for the
Hmm.
National Academy? Where what has stayed the same, or how does this moment react to 200 years ago?
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up, because we're very actively thinking about that in planning for the 200th anniversary. and really focusing in on that idea of America, what
Mm.
it means today, how it's changed over 200 years. Um, and the anniversary will it's going to be a year long sort of celebration series of special exhibitions,
Okay.
programs, public programs, and other projects. And it really is meant to use the history of the Academy as a lens through which to sort of critically explore 2 centuries of American art and architecture.
Mm.
Um, and again, I think to really look at those founding principles, but think about them in a 21st century context. And so, to the American point, in 1825, they're very much like sort of preoccupied with this idea of what is an American art, how is it different than French art, Italian art. I mean, it's all
Mhm.
very nationally
Right.
informed.
Right.
But what does it mean for America, which is this country that has been sprung up out? It's this agglomeration of
Right.
different, um, and certainly, it is not the open and equal space that it claims to be.
Right.
So I think for us now, I mean, there's no way. Obviously, we could have planned the, um, what's happened in the past, 5, 10 years.
Yeah.
But I think it's such an incredible opportunity um, to pause for us at this moment of a milestone anniversary and really think about like this whole idea of America. What is America? How has it fallen short of its promises and or potential? And um, and again, to like really think about what is even today, 200 years later, what is an American art?
Yeah, and in the vision document that you all
Uh-huh.
produced, and I don't know, I think this came out after you were there. I don't think this is was
Yeah, this is something that one of the first things that I worked on.
okay. In the introduction to that, you
Hmm.
write a list of questions that you say that the Academy began asking itself in 2019, and these questions that you list are: how can artists and architects help shape public conversations about our shared future? What is the
Hmm.
role of art and culture in civic life? And how do art institutions make themselves more open and accessible? We've been talking around some of those questions very generally, and I'm not asking
Yeah,
you to answer these these questions now, but I'm wondering sort of how you're thinking about those questions today. And this might relate to my previous question about how you position the National
yep,
Academy. But I do think in this moment of questioning, this moment of like what is America generally,
yeah.
and then also
Well, and I
specifically what
think
is American
if the
art?
next in that paragraph you're reading, I think the next sentence is, but what they didn't do is really ask what is America and
Yeah,
who is it
yeah,
for? Is that
yeah,
right? Like
yeah.
something along those lines.
How do you think about even trying to answer those questions? Those seem like such complicated questions, especially in this moment. And I'm just wondering like how you and your team and the idea of the National Academy thinks about its position in this moment, um, and how that's the same and how it's different than 1825 in
Yeah,
some way.
yeah.
I still think like there's this interesting parallel that I'm just kind of curious
Hmm.
how you even think about approaching those.
Yeah, I mean, they're big questions, and certainly with um, like relation our relation to the larger art world. I don't know if this is going to answer that question, but
Okay.
like I think we are with the sale of the buildings. It sort of liberated us from having to maintain this very expensive real estate that
Mm,
the National Academy did not have the resources to maintain properly, and was a real drag on the institution. So it was a liberation to really think about like, okay, what is this place now in the 21st century? Um, and for me, it was important that the Academy really reaffirm its commitment to the contemporary.
mm,
That at the core of the institution are these 450 living, practicing artists and architects who are doing incredible work. They're really sort of leaders in cultural practice, and to really commit the organization to them and giving them both a platform to present their work and ideas,
mm.
and to see where it leads the organization also,
Yeah.
and how through their work we can help answer these questions but explore other questions as well.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
I, so I come to this conversation as a designer. I come from the design world, and so I'm curious. So you were founded in 1825, originally called the New York Drawing Association,
Yep.
and then change your name very early to the National Academy of the Arts of Design. And then you became the National Academy of Design in 1828. And you were then National Academy of Design until 1997, when briefly changed the name to the National Academy Museum and School of Fine
Mm-hmm.
Art,
Yep.
and then returned to the name National Academy of Design in 2017. And that
Yes.
is a very long-winded way of asking about this word design in your title. What does
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
mean to you? What does that mean to the organization? Why does design feel appropriate to what you're doing and what you're trying to do?
Yeah. You know, it's a great question. It's something that I think those of us at the institution now take for granted, but it is very confusing for people outside, and certainly for just the general public. They're like, "Oh, I love design. Do you do fashion design? Do you do industrial design?" Like, "Oh, no, no, it's not that kind of design." And it's
Right.
because in 1825, design, the use of design at that point, it sort of comes out of, if you think of disegno or dessin, the
Mm-hmm.
Italian and French words for drawing.
Right.
And so at that point, the design arts were the arts that really relied on drawing as part of the practice.
Mm-hmm.
So painting, sculpture, engraving, and architecture. The four art forms that today we would call the fine arts, but at that point they were called the design arts. So the
Mm-hmm.
National Academy of Design was really meant to refer to like basically the National Academy of Painting, Sculpture, Engraving, and Architecture. And it probably should have been called the National Academy of the Fine Arts, but it was that meant something different in 1825, which is why you can see they changed. It starts with the New York Drawing Association
Yep.
to really sort of foreground drawing as the primary purpose. They changed it to design, National Academy of Design
Right.
in 1826, and then, or sorry, the National Academy of the Arts of Design.
Right.
And then I'm guessing they just went to shorten it, so they got rid of the art sub. But in 1997,
Right.
that change is very explicitly to try to address this confusion around the word design that's not used the same way today that it was then.
Right.
And so they just got rid of it. But then that became even more confusing. So it's like, what's the National Academy of what?
I think that makes sense historically, and I'm not. I want to be clear. I'm not saying that it should not be design. I actually I like an expansive definition of design, but I'm curious. Kind of, you mentioned that you take it for granted a little bit. What does that word mean to you? Like, how do you think about design, and how does it actually still relate to what you're doing? I guess is kind of what I'm curious about.
I mean, I think
Or
of
does
it
it or
now.
does it not? Maybe it doesn't.
Yeah, it doesn't, not in the sense that we're using design in the 21st century. It doesn't
Okay.
really. I
Okay.
mean, aside, now having said that, I mean, architecture is very much part of the program, and architects are very much part of the membership. So there's that. But I think it's just, like an archaic vestige that's just held over from the old days. I think, and this is interesting talking to you because you worked at AIGA, is that right?
Yeah, yeah. I was an editor there for a
So
couple of years.
AIGA did something. Didn't they change their name to
Yeah,
just, it's
it's just
AIGA is the name,
AIGA.
right? That's
Yeah,
it. Doesn't
yeah.
stand for anything.
Right.
So I actually often think of AIGA in
Okay.
this name
Right.
question because they were just like, all right, let's just forget all the others. We're just going to call ourselves AIGA. That's it.
Right. Because AIGA technically, or the history is American Institute of Graphic Arts.
Yeah.
And that's, no one calls what they do graphic arts anymore. Instead of changing the name, it already had that acronym. And so,
They
just,
just went with the acronym. They went
just
full in on the acronym.
that's an interesting parallel that I did not think of. But speaking of AIGA, actually, let's
Yeah.
sort of stay on this thread for a
Sure.
second. Because that is a nonprofit that's similar. I think, it's not structured the exact same way. It's not doing the exact same thing that you're doing. For graphic designers, your basically entire career has been in the nonprofit space, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right before you joined the National Academy in September 2020. Before that, you
Right.
were director of Open House New York. You spent a lot of time at the Architectural League of
Yes.
New York. I'm I'm very interested in the role of nonprofits
Hmm.
in the architecture and design worlds. And I had Jacob Moore, who's the current director, on the show. I had Jose, who's the director of Storefront for Art and Architecture. And I talked to them about this a little bit too. Um, the nonprofit space, it sort of maintains a very weird position in these worlds, a hard to define, I shouldn't say weird, a hard to define position in these worlds. I'm wondering how you think about the role of nonprofits
Yeah.
and this type of work in the larger architecture and design worlds. Where how do you see them sitting? What do they bring that
Mhm.
different types of institutions might not be able to bring?
Yeah, yeah. No, I think this is an important question. And I listened to your episode with Jacob,
Oh, great.
and I know that you two were talking about it as sort of practice versus academia, and then you have nonprofits being this sort of third space where people, and I think that's right. And I think like certainly at the league, I mean, to sort of keep the conversation focused on architecture, I guess, um, that for the league, I think it was a platform for people who are doing really interesting, important work who did not have an academic affiliation where they were able to sort of have
Yeah.
an outlet for it. Um, and frequently it was work that they were developing in practice, but it became a platform for disseminating to a larger public.
Right.
And I think maybe this is based on what I know of your work that you and I think, parallel each other. I mean, I'm really interested in how ideas move
Uh-huh.
around in the world,
Uh-huh.
like
Uh-huh.
with the vehicles and the means of communication. And
Yeah.
so I've always thought of nonprofit organizations like League and like the National Academy as being spaces that really help communicate these cultural ideas to broader audiences
Yeah.
and to connect people with the ideas.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I think that's really well said. You can almost think about a nonprofit as another type of media, is
Mm-hmm.
another
Yeah,
another way. And
absolutely.
I mean, I don't mean to repeat the conversation with Jacob, but one of the things that he and I talked about, I'm kind of curious your perspective as someone who's made a career running these types of institutions, being involved in these types of institutions, is this tension that I see as somebody who has little experience really being a part of them, but is a fan of them, a supporter of them, is that they they maintain a type of independence
Mm-hmm.
that the profession does not have, and that academia does not have. They're they're sort of beholden to different types of things, but and that freedom I find very compelling. That kind of blurriness, and as Jacob and I talk about, but at the same time, in many ways, they're the most financially precarious. They are the hardest to maintain. And I don't know if I have a specific question, but I'm wondering how you think about that. How do you think about and I don't mean I don't want this to become a business podcast, but how do you think about the funding and often lack thereof of these
Mm-hmm.
types of spaces that create this type of discourse? Where how do we make these institutions stronger? How do we make them more stable? And I'm not asking you to talk specifically about the National Academy, although you can if you
Yeah.
want, while also maintaining that, in my opinion, sort of very important independence
Yeah.
too. Do
Yeah.
you have
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think this is, on the this larger question of the role of nonprofits, like as independent for presenting these ideas, that's why they're important.
Right.
But maintaining that independence is exhausting, raising the money. Like, and you can ask anyone who works at any of these organizations, like so much energy and time is spent scrambling for money, and every year, day in, day out. Um,
Yeah.
it's a real slog. It's exhausting.
Is there something we can learn or take, or is there a model that these types of nonprofit organizations that you've been a part of that we can learn from, whether we are in a nonprofit or not, those of us in architecture, design, media, to create a kind of robust critical discourse around these things,
Yeah.
and the reason I'm asking that is because I think the I have no data to back anything up that I'm about to say, but I think these professions think that they want a critical discourse, but um, I don't really see any tangible action to actually try to support that. And I think
Hmm.
academia also wants to have relevance in this moment, and to publish widely, but there's a kind of historical tension there, and um, sort of the spaces where academics talk to each other don't create these larger discourses. And I wonder if there's something about these really non-traditional, slightly unusual organizations that we can actually learn from to rethink these sort of media infrastructures. You know what I mean? That's a big
Hmm.
question, but
Yeah, yeah.
you know what I mean?
Yeah, and so this isn't going to answer that exactly, but maybe
Okay.
we'll get there.
Okay.
But I think what's interesting, particularly being at the National Academy of Design, which, as though I said, it sort of commingles artists and architects,
Right.
but it is heavily weighted on the artist side.
Mm.
Of the
Mm-hmm.
current membership, for instance, as an example,
Yeah.
there are 450 living members. 80% of them are practicing visual artists, and then 20% are architects, to
Mm.
just give you a sense of the sort
Okay.
of
Okay.
proportions. So it's really an arts organization that has some architecture folded in. And the
Right.
reason I'm bringing this up, because I think what's interesting, having worked for a long time in explicitly architecture organizations, the funding sources for architecture
Uh,
as a cultural form are fewer and far less than they are for the visual arts or the performing arts, for that matter,
yeah.
which was always really frustrating. Like the number of foundations, for instance, the number of private foundations that are grant making organizations giving money to support um, cultural programming, they pretty much only fund the arts, which they don't
Right.
count architecture really as one of the arts.
Right.
So that was always a challenge, is trying to convince funders that architecture is an important cultural field that deserves support,
Yeah.
and the work that these organizations are all doing is an important service to the public.
So how did you do that?
But well, we never really convinced them. I can't say we were successful. So what you do is you have to find other means for raising the money, which is why there's so many fundraising benefit dinners, which
Right.
everyone complains about having to buy tickets for another dinner and sit through, some meal, and but they're lucrative and they raise money.
Right. Right.
It's a fundraising model that works, even though I know a lot of people get
Right.
sick of them.
Everyone hates them. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
It does what it needs to do.
I mean, I'll say in New York City, and I really, this is like credit has to go to the New York architecture community, because there are, depending on how you're counting, there are like 7 different organizations at least
Yeah.
in this realm dealing
Yeah.
with architecture and urban design, and doing programming of various sorts,
Yeah.
lectures, panel discussions, sometimes exhibitions. And I'm talking about the Center for Architecture, AIA, the Architectural League, Storefront,
Yeah.
Design Trust for Public Space, Van Allen Institute. All of them struggle, but they are all able to support themselves because the architecture community steps up and is buying tickets for all
Mm.
these dinners and sponsoring various programs that they're doing. So it's a
That,
robust, active field that is able to support itself. And I'll add
yeah.
that we often amongst ourselves are like, there are too many of us. This is not a long term. We're not going to last for the long term. What
Yeah.
do we do here?
Although that does make me reconsider what I previously said, where I said the profession seem they say that they want this sort of thing, but I don't see any sort of tangible effort. And I guess that's not necessarily true. Paying for these dinners, going to these things, maybe that is the way to do it. That these middle nonprofit spaces are being supported by the other side, academia and the profession, in just
Yeah.
sort of sometimes indirect ways. I'm I'm curious about your own career, if we could
Hmm.
just sort of talk about yourself for a second. So you studied art history.
Hmm.
You did some PhD work on art and architecture history. I'm wondering how you found yourself in this nonprofit space and why that has really held your interest for your entire career.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So yeah, so I studied art. I mean, it's always been art and architectural history.
Right.
And I went to Rutgers undergraduate, and I was finishing, and you're like, oh, I have to go find a job now. How do I do this? And it was complete chance that I was walking by the Career Center, and at that point, this is 1992,
Okay.
you would go to a place and flip through a binder of paper
Right.
and look at job
Yeah.
announcements. It's all, it was in person on paper, which sounds so, that makes me
Yeah.
sound so old. There's no, you're not going on LinkedIn or anywhere.
Right.
Like,
Right.
so I just happened to go, I was walking by that one day, and there was a job posting at the Architectural League for an administrative assistant.
Okay.
And I was like, I don't understand what this place does, but sure, I need a job. I'll, I loved architecture. And that was always my concentration in the art history
Okay.
department. So I was like, architecture, okay, let's do it. And and literally, like, that was it. I sent my resume. I went in for the interview, and I got hired. And at that point, I think I was telling myself, oh, what I really want to do is be an architect. But Rutgers University of New Brunswick didn't have an architecture program, so that's why I was in the art history department. And then I went to the league, and by the end of the first year, I was like, oh, I don't want to be an architect, because I was, when you're in that
Right.
realm, like, I'm seeing what architects do day to day, and hearing what it's like to be an architect. I was like, oh,
Yeah.
hell no, I don't
Yeah.
want to be an
Yeah.
architect. I was like, I like this.
Yeah.
I like being outside the practice and being able to think about the ideas, but not actually having to
Right.
draw somebody's
Right.
bathroom. Like,
Right.
this is what I want to do.
Right. Right. I relate to that. I
Yeah,
that
I figured you would.
sounds familiar to me.
um, yeah, and so that was a pretty quick. Um, I came to a pretty quick understanding with that. I was like, oh no,
Okay.
this is what I want to do, and I just loved, like, an organization like League, and any of these organizations, really, there's such crossroads of so many people are coming through, and what they're working on is so interesting, and you're just exposed to
Yeah.
so much, and I loved that environment.
Was there anything in your art history education, your art and architecture history education that you feel shapes how you approach this work that you're doing? And I realize, I understand the cultural side of it. I understand the sort of the discourse that we've been talking about, this idea of like being more interested in talking about it than doing it. But I'm also thinking about what we were just talking about, the fundraisers,
Yeah.
the galas, the act of actually running a business. Is there anything from studying history that you feel like has shaped how you approach these roles that you've had?
That's a good question. I mean, as you were formulating this question, I was like, no, not at all. And I hate to say that, but I think the art history and architectural history education, it was more what I was getting out of being in the office.
Yeah, yeah,
That's where that shaped it a lot.
yeah.
And being at the architectural league definitely was, formative in every possible way. But the like, classes, not really. I mean, maybe in some sense, the sense of history, and that what we were doing and what I'm doing today is part of a history that extends
Mm-hmm,
backwards. And so
mm-hmm.
having a really, actually, all right, so let me change this, because now that I'm thinking of it like this,
Okay,
both I was at the league, and I was doing my PhD program when the league was celebrating its 125th anniversary.
okay.
And I was the staff person really in charge of the sort of the research, the historical research related to that anniversary. And now I'm at the National Academy when it's doing its 200th
Okay,
anniversary,
yeah.
both of which involved me going to Washington to the Archives of American Art, where I spent a lot of time sort of delving into the archives of these two organizations. And in that sense, it's not, didn't happen at school, but let's say it was sort of
Right.
an archival historical
Yeah,
research process.
yeah.
That helped a lot and made me realize, like, particularly with the National Academy, A lot of the challenges it has today are repeating and have been repeating over the 2 centuries.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, oh my God, are you serious? They were dealing with the same thing in
Right.
1865,
Right.
and we're
Right.
still dealing with the same thing.
I mean, maybe that's a way to ask my last question. And you hinted at this actually very early in our conversation. Um, but in 2016, and this was before your tenure at the National Academy, the entire organization was restructured. It
Yes.
closed the school and the museum. You sold these buildings on the Upper East Side. Um, you're now in a space in Chelsea, but that reorganization, and again, this all happened. I know this happened before you created this permanent endowment to
Yep.
ensure the kind of long term success of the institution. And so, hearing you say that like the challenges you're facing now, you've seen those in
Yes.
history, it strikes me, and this has come up in this conversation a couple times, it strikes me that in many ways, yes, you are leading a 200-year institution, but you are also leading a very new organization.
Oh, absolutely.
It is both 200 years and also very, very new. I'm wondering how you think about that and where you see it going. As you approach this historical moment for the institution that is also a rebuilding moment, what does the new National Academy look like? What do the next 10, 15, 100,
Yeah. Yeah.
200 years
Yeah. The next 200
look like?
years.
Yeah, how are you thinking about that now in this moment of transition for the academy?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a great question. It's something I talk about with every person that we hire because I say, listen, I know it's this moment of great possibility and transition, and we're building something new, and everyone gets so excited. And it's like, listen, that sounds great and it's sexy and everyone gets excited. But let me tell you, it is very hard. Starting over is very hard. You are going to have to make everything from scratch again.
Yeah,
And so there are going to be days where you're like, I don't want to do this anymore. I give up. So which is just to say it's a really exciting time because it feels like anything is possible, but it is
right,
also
right.
it is really hard. We are starting over in a lot of ways.
What does that new National Academy look like? As much as you can say, I
Yeah,
realize this
yeah.
is all in progress, but how do you think about that? Where does this all go? What is the role of the National Academy into the future past these 200 years?
Yeah, I for me, I don't have an answer so much as the way I sort of structure my work is to ask a series of questions like that. Like, what is this?
Mm,
I mean, the big question for me is always, what is the purpose of an academy in the 21st century? And when we're talking about academy, we're not talking about. I mean, the word
right.
academy sort of shifted in its usage over 200 years. I mean, so I'm talking about in the sense of, we were modeled very explicitly on the Royal Academy of Arts in London, or you think of
Yeah.
the Académie Française. So it's like that kind of academy. This academy where you have academicians. Like,
Right.
what is the purpose of this thing today when it exists in this much larger, broader cultural ecosystem where there are plenty of places where you can
Yeah.
go for an arts education. There are plenty of places where you can go look at art. There's an
Yeah.
entire district of New York City dedicated to selling artwork, contemporary artwork.
Right.
So what is our purpose? And I sort of leave it at the question mark. And I'm like, okay, well, let's try this
Right.
and let's
Right.
try this. A lot of it, and I alluded to this earlier also, a lot of it does have to do with we also have this community of artists and architects. And so I sort of, when I get lost or overwhelmed, I go back to them. I'm
Yeah.
like, okay, they're the heart of this place. Let's look and see who's doing something really interesting, and let's just like give them the mic and see what it where it leads us.
I do like that earlier in this conversation we sort of wondered whether design was the right word for this, and then you just now also started to question the word academy, and I feel like this whole thing is like, we're down to national. The rest of these words maybe,
Oh, right, which is the question that I think you sort of
which
asked. I avoid it, but that is something that we talk a lot about. Is what does the National Academy mean,
right.
and who is I don't know if this was the question, but like who is the audience? What's the audience of New York versus the audience of the country? And in theory, we want to honor that National Academy, but it's hard And again, that sounds great, but
Right.
there is a reality that we are limited by physics and geography. We are
Right.
here. People have to exist in space.
Yeah.
We have limited funds, so we're not opening offices in 12 cities across the country. Yeah, okay, well, we could travel exhibitions, we could do programs in different places. But what is, and again, this is like, I asked the question, I don't necessarily know what the answer is, but I'm
Yeah.
okay with that. I'm okay not knowing what the answer is. I'm okay exploring and thinking of all of this as like a research project. It's like, let's ask questions and try a couple of things and see, does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Yeah.
I don't traveling like okay, we're national because we travel exhibitions. To me, that's not enough.
Right.
That
Right.
doesn't really get to the heart of what it means to be national.
Right. I I do think in a weird way that this brings the conversation full circle though, sort of talking about what do how does this group of artists and architects both educate themselves and the public? And in
Mm,
many ways that's the question we've been asking through this entire conversation also. How how do different types of institutions, different types of media, et cetera, both help the artists, the architects, the designers, and then also sort of talk about this stuff
yeah,
broadly to
to a
a
larger
public
audience.
that is has different definitions and different scales, et cetera. So I think in a weird way that this brings this conversation full circle, and it's a really nice way to wrap all of this up. Thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah,
Thanks for
yeah,
being on
this
the
is fun.
podcast.
I wish we had another hour, and I hope we can continue this conversation because I have so much I want to ask you
Yeah.
about your work. So
That was my conversation with Gregory Wessner. It was recorded on November 8th, 2024. Our theme music is by Jeremiah Chu. The show is and always will be free thanks to the generosity of listeners like you. If you like what we do here, I hope you consider supporting us and get some bonus content each month. You can follow us across social media at Surface Podcast, and you can listen to all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at our website, scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.